Well, first, it was an honor to be around so many esteemed panelists, so many legendary figures from the civil rights movement to now. People who have done things, not just talking about it from a standpoint of research or a standpoint of reading, but these folks have actually engaged with boots on the ground. So it was an honor, to have Teresa Cordova, the director, invite us out because she's a person who actually had experience in the field doing these movements. Gus Newport, Timuel Black, Dr. Harris, Dr. Gale, Anthony Lowry, Jose Lopez. I mean, these are historical figures. So as a young guy, I was honored, like to be mentioned in the same breath with these folks. I was honored. In the same sense, disappointed that my generation haven't done enough to carry on the work that they started for us, the foundation that they laid. Because 50 years later, not too much has gotten better. Things are still either the same or worsened in America, particularly for communities of color, Black and Latino communities. So I was disappointed that we haven't yet to address the inequalities around housing, education, employment, and race relations, as well as police relations with the communities. Being around Baba Gus Newport and them, and a lot of elders, you start to learn that they begin a process to start being independent of government, independent of the institutions, the private sector, and when they took on activities. So here's a guy from Cabrini Green who advocated for public housing all the way from the local level to the federal level. And when disappointed that we couldn't get anything accomplished, we went to the United Nations to list, the demolition and disposition as a crime against humanity, the plight of African Americans in America as a crime against humanity. And after, hosting the very first UN visit to America, in honor of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X's work, I come to find out, well, this is what Dr. King talked about and Brother Malcolm X talked about, and they come here and there's no, what I tell people, there's no blue Hammond and brown trucks, there's no UN peacekeepers. There's no enforcement of all this stuff that's happening overseas for other nations. So who enforces our human rights in America in the absence of the US government, in the absence of the UN? I thought it was our moral responsibility to begin to enforce the human right. And one of the ways we did it was by taking over vacant and foreclosed homes, fixing them up to address the issue of homeless women and children ability to access, safe and decent housing. And so that's how the human rights enforcement part came out. Let's stop waiting on the world to save us. These institutions and government, let us, the people, come up with a solution for each other and save ourselves. So we said, since the United Nations is not going to enforce human rights in America, we gave ourselves our own oath and declared that we were human rights enforcers. I think as Americans, we come from a place of privilege, from the poor folks to the rich folks. I think we think in exceptionalism. America is a country that believes in exceptionalism. We're exceptional to the cause, right? That's the rule for everybody else but us. And as regular citizens, we've been trained in a box to think of our problems as that of civil rights, something domestic, not something that's broader like human rights. And we believe that only we as America can solve our problems. Once again, exceptionalism and arrogance by the American people in government, right? Believing that we're better than everybody else so we don't have to follow the standard rules and practices. It's okay for us to military enforce human rights across the globe, but it's not okay for us to practice human rights in America. And I think that's one of the challenges is around the arrogance of Americans and the exceptionalism that exists in America. I definitely think all of this is connected to the Kerner Commission. I mean, the report laid out everything that we're trying to do today, and it's 50 years later, we're not taking heed to this. Had we took heed to the Kerner Commission report, implemented some of the things they said, I think the world would be a different place. I think America would be really looked at as a model that's worthy of the rest of the country to follow, right? And the rest of the world to follow, right? But without America having the practice of human rights at home, I believe that is one of the biggest problems we're having on the world stage with convincing other nations to do right. Because now for the first time in U.S. history, over the last 4 or 5 years, you have foreign governments talking about the problems in America when we're addressing international problems. Like, don't tell us about how we're treating the people in Iraq, Iran, if you're not treating the people right in Chicago, right? This came up during Katrina. Don't come tell these other nations how to rebuild their country if you ain't solved the crisis of Katrina. So I believe America would have just implemented, and still has a chance to address the Kerner Commission and implement some of the recommendations. If they do that, we'll look better on the rest of the world. We'll look better to the rest of the world. The anti-eviction campaign was born out of necessity. Initially, I started off as a housing activist advocating for homeless and public housing residents. One, for the homeless folks to have access to public housing. Two, for public housing residents not to be displaced. In 2009, we tell folks it was born out of necessity. Less than 2 days after the United Nations had left the Special Rapporteur on Housing, which was the second mission by the United Nations to America to investigate. We learned that this problem go beyond race. We learned that there was folks in rural Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, white folks who was being displaced because the steel factories left. There was a foreclosure crisis going on, and we learned that, look, this stretched beyond just public housing and homeless folks. This is actually hitting our working class and middle class America now. And we decided that we needed an organization, because I was with a group called the Coalition to Protect Public Housing. We needed an organization that would embody all housing groups, right? All housing rights, from the homeless person to the homeowner, a space where folks can organize together to ensure that there was some type of human rights to housing. And so we was born out of necessity in 2009 in Cabrini Green. And what we was attempting to do, and not take over a bunch of vacant properties out there offset, was just match up homeless people, public housing residents, renters, and homeowners together so that they can effectively advocate as a collective to get some type of resolve. Everybody has to get involved. So what I like to tell people out there who's not doing that, you can be an armchair activist. Everybody don't have to hit the front line like us with the bullhorn in the crowd. You can do so many things, from writing your local elected official, the private institution, the universities, telling everybody, let's have these conversations, let's get involved, right? Let's bring a recourse. I mean, and we always tell people, here's the pep talk. There's nothing at stake but our future. You know, who cares? I mean, does Earth end with us, right? Does the way we know it and the opportunities we've been given, as minimal as they might have been, does that end with this generation? Do anybody in this generation see it as necessary to do some work to prepare the next generation, you know, to inherit this world that we know? And currently, under the current administration and the current political climate in America, race is an issue that's have taken us 50, 60, 70 years back. I want to know what we need to do as a collective to move us forward. And I believe that starts to happen when the common man in America and women begin to have a conversation, difficult conversation, on what they should be doing to better their community, better their city. It's generational. Like he tried, I think one of the analogies Mr. Black made was during World War II. So many things happened, right? And I tell people the anti-eviction campaign tactics and strategy come from post-World War II, during the Great Depression era. I'm not the first one to put thousands of people in the street fighting eviction. That happened during the 30s in Chicago, right? We're not the first group to take people off the street, fix up a vacant house and move them in. That happened historically since the 30s in America, right? One of the things we tried to point out, though, every generation when faced with a crisis got some type of concession from government. But in order to do that, every generation came together. They put their differences aside of race, class, political beliefs, religion, to say we have to do something as a collective to remind the government that they work for the people. It happened with the New Deal with President Roosevelt. It happened, as you heard today, with Lyndon B. Johnson. The Kerner Commission made recommendations. Every generation had a task, and it fulfilled. I think we're challenged as this generation of fulfilling our moral responsibility and living up to the shoulders of giants that we stand on. And so I challenge folks to get out there and get involved. But yeah, since the World War II, this has been systemic. These issues of the right to land and resources have been systemic. I believe one of the things that makes for organic activism is social media. You know, I believe that this young generation is gifted by their ability to quickly organize using social media apparatuses, right? Be it Twitter, Facebook, or whatever social media outlet they're using to organize. I think it's also a crippler, right? Because you're not engaged in traditionally going door to door, pulling 2, 3, 4 people out of a household. You're just connecting to people who pre-exist in your network already. And we always say to build a movement, you got to go out of what you're comfortable with doing, right? You got to go outside of organizing within your own circles. And I think that's one of the crippling effects of social media, that it keeps you connected to the people you're connected to. And if you really want to change some things in this world, you're going to have to open up some other people's mind who might not traditionally agree with you. Being here today, with UIC Greater Cities Institute, is historic in itself. It's not just 50 years later after the Kerner Commission Report, but it's less than a year later after the report Greater City Institute put out on unemployment and underemployability, right? I think Mr. Scudero did a great job of making that connection, right? That look, some of the same problems we faced 50 years ago exist today. And the role of the university is to highlight them things, to offer that space. And so the Greater City Institute did a great job of not just bringing out, this is 50 years later after the Kerner Commission Report, but to say, look, we're continuing our research in areas that make sense to the community. And that our reports that we're releasing also highlights a lot of the things, or how can we say it? There's intersections between what Greater City Institute research project has produced and the Kerner Commission Report, right? 50 years later, right? We're saying the same thing, that these inequalities exist around education, housing, healthcare, employment, right? That racism is more prevalent now than it was then, And I'm not putting that on one administration. I'm just saying in the last two administrations, we watch America shift from a progressive administration to an administration that seems to fuel a lot of racism in the country, right? Or the perception that they're fueling racism, or the perception that they're ignorance to the racial undertone that is happening. And so we're saying more than ever that this report, the Kerner Commission Report, is more important today than it was back then, because now we're in that moment today where we're challenged by racism, right? We're challenged by inequality. We're challenged by our immigration policy. We're challenged around women's rights. We're challenged around race. We're challenged around so many things. So I'm thankful that the institute like UIC Greater City Institute has heeded the call, right? Is leading in discussions around things today that are relevant to these times as were they during the 60s and the civil rights movement. Some of my thoughts around like the connections or the intersections between racism, classism, economics. A lot of my theory behind it was dispelled during a foreclosure crisis, right? I kind of learned that, although redlining existed in the 60s and the 70s, although African-American Latinos are marginalized by where they can move in certain parts of the city or the country, I think the foreclosure crisis taught us something, right? That truly in America, that when it comes to money and the right to land, America is equal opportunity oppressor. It doesn't matter your race. You might have a racial analysis, I'm white, I have certain privileges. You might have an analysis that, I'm a cop, I'm a firefighter, I'm in a different class, I'm a working class person. I have a class analysis that say I'm not impacted by these things. But when the foreclosure crisis hit, when the mortgage bubble burst, everybody lost, right? And it was right then in that moment that I learned, right, that here's an opportunity to bring all these folks who were separated by class, whether it be working status, race, to show them that there were commonalities in their struggle, that everybody was one paycheck away from being homeless, right? And given that threat, everybody had a responsibility, a moral responsibility to do something about it. One of the things the media does and government does, they do a great job of propaganda, right? I think I spoke about it earlier today about how they individualize people issues, right? We're going to fight for education over here. We're going to fight for housing over here. We're going to fight against mass incarceration over here. Or your healthcare fight is separate from this immigration fight. Your LGBTQ fight is separate from this fight. I think one of the challenges in America right now is people's ability to work through the collective. Look, you can't blame the president for everything. The president is not responsible for everybody's opinion and behavior, right? I mean, we have, outside of the president, we have a Congress and a Senate. And that's why I think one of the greatest threats to America today is not just this administration, the perception of a racist administration. I think the singularity of it being this administration's fault and not the duality of it's this administration, presidential, Congress, and the Senate fault, right? It's a combination of everybody's fault. I don't want to say that this president is not doing this right, he has these viewpoints, and then excuse Congress and the Senate for performing their daily duties because of a president, right? There is no excuse to what's going on in America. Congress really needs to deal with what's going on in America. The Senate needs to really deal with what's going on in America. Because I can tell you this much, if there was an economic crisis in America again with the banks and corporations, Congress and the Senate would find a way to put their differences to the side to save corporate America, right? To make sure we don't go bankrupt into a depression. I'm saying the same thing can be done around class issues and race issues. You know, Americans have to drive that conversation, not government. And if I could tell American people anything, don't worry about the type of world you're living in today. Worry about what happens if you do nothing about it and the type of world you leave for the future of tomorrow. That's what we should be concerning ourselves with. Not the work we're doing today, but the type of future we're going to have tomorrow from the work we're not doing. And that's not the work of making it 9 to 5 to pay some bills. I'm talking about that's the social and cultural work that needs to happen to build a better future for this country and our people.